Hello, good afternoon. Happy Monday, everyone. Welcome in. So, today we're getting back into The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple by E.A.E. Reymond. And we're going into chapter 15 and possibly 16 today, but we're going to just do it like we feel it. All right. So, chapter 15, the bringing of life to the temple. In contrast to the coherent picture of the structural development, very little is known about the life and rites which were performed in the Temple of the Falcon. As stated, the temple in Wetchesset seems to have been founded and constructed prior to the constitution of the foundation ritual as known to us from historical times. We incline to the opinion that account may preserve the memory of customs connected with the foundation of sacred places which were in use in pre-dynastic Egypt and from which derived the later foundation and consecration ritual of an Egyptian temple. The account of the laying out of the first sacred enclosure of the falcon alludes to a simple rite which may be considered as a magical rite of protection. Unfortunately, the text of the record is at this point very brief, and the significance of this rite may only theoretically be reconstructed from the general meaning of that part of the narration. Moreover, the text does not give any definite title of this rite. We may perhaps doubt whether this mythical rite was indeed a foundation rite in the strict sense, or whether it was a rite performed with a view to consecrating or reconsecrating the foundation ground of the enclosure. We recall that the Shebtu brought symbols from the BWHNM, and that the Egyptians believed this piece of land to have been sacred prior to the creation of the falcon's sacred place. The extent of this enclosure was believed to have restored the ground of a pre-existing sacred place of the earth god. It results that this rite aimed at ensuring the sacred nature of land, which was believed to have been naturally delimited. It follows that in remote times there were no foundations in the strict sense, only acts which might appear obscure, even to the Egyptians of historical times, and therefore they were conceived to be a ceremony of a magical order which the creators performed themselves. It can be added from our text that following this act, some kind of offerings which are not described were presented, presumably to the god. These IHT are possibly the same substances as those required at the creation of the earth. The text, however, says nothing more, and speculation is vain. A somewhat more explicit account is given of the ceremony which was performed after the construction of the enclosure. Tannin played the prominent part. Allusion is made to the safeguarding of the god, then to a procession which is said to be BS, or to conduct. So BS actually stands for to conduct, which is funny. We suspect that the record refers to the moment when the god was carried into the enclosure. Then the ceremony of fumigating was performed. It seems that we have in this very brief account the earliest evidence of the festival of entering the temple. If this interpretation be accepted, it would mean that this particular ceremony formed only a part of the creation of the temple, that this final act was exclusively the duty of Tannin. Tannin seems to play here the part of the protector of the god and of his resting place, and in this capacity he fulfilled the creation of the temple. If we recall the belief that Tannin was brought out of Nun as a protection, it becomes now logical that he did so. Hence, his function in the history of the temple was determined at the beginning of the world. Nothing is known of other rites and ceremonies which might have been performed in his early temple. We may think of very simple scenes of adoration, which were once performed in front of the perch within the original domain of Wetchesset. Perhaps there was performed a silent rite, or SGR. Certainly there were completed various acts of presenting offerings, which are described only by the common expression IRIHT, and possibly the acts of HW, sanctifying, to which the description of the physical appearance of the temple seems to allude briefly. No caps, welcome in. Happy Monday, dude. This is still way too hot to drink, even though I want it. But let's go in for some water instead. Welcome, dude. Welcome all. The myth about the origin of the solar temple introduces us to an entirely different situation. This circumstance is important both for the history of the Egyptian temple in general and for the origin of the ritual. We have already pointed to some of the rites connected with the solar temple. It is only necessary to refer to these rites with a view to filling in the picture of the bringing to life of the solar temple. We learn from the history of its origin that rites were already performed before the foundation of the outer enclosure of the temple was laid out. This, of course, might have been entailed by the fact that the foundation ground was a battlefield, and there was an urgent need to cleanse the site. It was also believed that in the secondary paylands, the foundation of the sacred domain began with the rite of purification, and that, consequently, this was the custom of a somewhat advanced stage of prehistoric times. The purification might have been regarded as an act of consecration which the land reached its final sacred nature. The text does not reveal how it was done. Only the title of the ceremony, TWR, has survived in the record. The text is unusually concise, but it seems that the initial ceremony was followed by one or several processions in which the statues and images of gods were carried around the sacred area, then assembled in its midst. This might perhaps have been the episode which is described in our text by the expression SNDMIM, or settling down there. Settling down there. The account seems to indicate that this procession of gods included also the image of an ancestral god who might eventually have been carried in front of the procession and been placed first on the foundation ground. This preliminary ceremony seems to have ended in a rite which might have been an act bearing on the constitution of a magical protection of the foundation ground. But the text is concise again, and we can only suggest that this final episode was performed by Tannin. Then occurred, perhaps, yet another procession of gods. All this is, perforce, a theoretical reconstruction. Perforce, Perforce. Wait, okay. I want to look it up. I've never read that word. I don't know it. Perforce. I'm getting kind of like ideas about what it means, but let's just see what Google says. Perforce, or perforce definition. Used to express necessity or inevitability. Cool. Perforce. Okay, good. Perforce. Hey, Paradox Fossils, welcome in, dude. Good to see you. Happy Monday. So all this is, perforce, a theoretical reconstruction. On the other hand, with reference to the situation in the Temple of the Falcon, this order of ceremony does not appear unnatural. It may be surmised that at that stage of the development of sacred places, the customs connected with what earlier sacred places were in part reenacted, in part replaced by ceremonies of a rather artificial kind, in order to imitate what was believed to have been essential in the history of the earlier sacred domains. Episodes of earlier date were probably used as rites preliminary to the foundation ceremony. What is certain is that in what follows, the history of the solar temple is entirely different from the sequence of creation in the Temple of the Falcon. It is legitimate to claim that the foundation of the solar temple gives the first definite evidence of a duly performed foundation ritual, the stretching of the cord. This was followed by the episode of the setting out of the four sides of the enclosure, which is SDDI IFDW. A detailed picture is preserved in our Edfu sources of what can be described as rites of consecration of a temple. Here again, the ritual episodes are interpreted as mythical events in which the gods themselves enacted the consecration of the temple. It seems that the Egyptians believed that Re and Tannin were not on the site when the temple was constructed, but they were told by Thoth and Sechet that the temple was fashioned in its proper place. They arrived at the site together with the assembly who were engaged in the creation of the temple. The first act to be performed then was the naming of the enclosing wall. This appears to have been the duty of Re. The assembly of gods proceeded to what is described as the place, or BW. In this context, the word seems to define the main part of the enclosure, since the text proceeds to tell us that the temple is in the place where the snake was first. Thereafter, another ceremony was performed by Tannin, and it was precisely by virtue of this act that the temple acquired its names. This situation is unknown from the history of the temple in Wetchesset Neter. The tradition connected with this temple seems to propound the idea that the temple was given this name after the land in which it was created. By way of contrast, in the history of the solar temple, the ceremony of giving names is dealt with as an independent act which appears to be of prime importance in the life of the temple. It would seem to result that in the secondary paylands, the temples, while physically existing, were regarded only as an entity. There was need of a special act to bring them to their real function. The relief that accompanies the 50 cosmogonical record furnishes further seems to illustrate the consecration rites that might have been performed in the solar temple following the episode described above. This scene manifests in belief that after the temple was given names by Tannin, the assembly of the creator gods performed a procession at which they sang hymns and recited spells of adoration. The short texts incorporated in this scene appear to describe an early festival of entering. This ceremony was opened by Tannin, who seems to have invited the god, the lord of the temple, to enter his sanctuary. Then Sechet was believed to utter a proclamation saying, the Earthmaker has been brought into the presence of Re in the seat of the two gods. An act of adoration of the temple itself, described as the Great Seat, was believed to have been performed thereafter by the Lord of the temple. He adored the sacred entity which came to be his home, and adored it by the names which Tannin had given to the temple. In this way, we learn that the joint solar temple was believed to have as its chief name that of the House of Appearance in the Mansion of the Throne. There is no evidence, however, to confirm that this was the name of an archaic temple of the sun god. This name might well have been formulated in the tradition of a later date with the view to describing the significance and purpose of the temple. The important fact is that an early ritual of consecration of the temple seems to have included a ceremony of adoring the temple itself. Thereafter, a procession seems to have been conducted along the four sides of the enclosure walls, the participants being the deities who were engaged in the consecration of the temple. It is of prime importance that during this ceremony, mention is made of the Earthmaker. We imagine that perhaps there is an allusion to the image of the Earthmaker, which was carried in front of the procession, then brought into the main sanctuary of the temple. We are inclined to see in the presence of the Earthmaker in the ceremony of the consecration of the temple further evidence of the close connection between Earth God and the temple as an entity. Saturnian, good to see you, man. Happy Monday. Welcome in. Man, this is still steaming away. Oh, too hot. A closely similar situation emerges from the account of the Temple of Misnet, MS-NHT. Its construction Having been completed, a procession was performed around the enclosure. After a greeting episode performed by Ray, in which the temple is invoked as the enclosure of the divine company, there followed what appeared to be an act of blessing the IHT, or the substances. I think that's IHT, blessing the substances. This episode is not mentioned in the description of the consecration of the joint temple. It recalls, however, the ceremony performed over the IHT, or substances, in the enclosure of the falcon. The gods proceeded once more in procession around the enclosure. Then Tek and Tannen gave names to the temple. From this ceremony, we learn that the temple seems to have consisted of two parts, of which one was the hall bearing the name of Great Seat, while the other is described as Sanctuary and bears the name Misnet. A spell was recited by Ray, in which he ordered the gods of his company to settle here, or settle there, rather. Since then, the enclosure seems to have borne the name the Domain of the Gods. The following narrative alludes to the association between the god, NTR, most probably the lord of the temple, and his ancestor, who is said to be Tannen. It appears that a mystic act was believed to have ended the order of the ceremonies. This, however, is the sole evidence occurring in our document. The tradition seems to imply the belief that the temple was constructed not only to house the god, but also the dwelling place of other divine beings, especially as the resting place of the ancestor god. It would allow that after, or rather, it would follow after the temple had been constructed and was given names, it was necessary for the sun god to issue a command in order to occupy the temple. The deities who took part in the creation of this temple seem to have constituted the first company of the co-Templar deities of the god. Templar. The last ceremony to be performed was again a procession. The sun god and his fellows are said to have proceeded along the four sides of the temple. They entered into the temple and took their rightful position within it. Then a magical rite seems to have been performed by Tannen to ensure the protection of the house of the god. Although these texts are, in part at least, affected by later editing and by the Edfu tradition, their close connection with the set of cosmological records is obvious and gives them the value of a document. We suspect that we have in these short texts hints of what once was a complete set of rites which were duly performed in the sacred enclosures of remote times. There perhaps existed a record of a high date that preserved the consecration ritual in the use of primitive temples. This record might have been, in the Edfu redaction, broken into short sentences and modified for a descriptive purpose. It does not seem improbable that the Edfu pictorial evidence has preserved an account of the order of ceremonies which were real and were enacted in the early temple of proto-dynastic Egypt, if not even during the late stage of the pre-dynastic period. Sending you the good vibes, dude. Uno momento, por favor. Boom. Oh man, the wind is like getting it again. We had massive windstorms here. We were out of power for 13 hours Saturday. And I didn't think we were gonna, or I didn't know. I was really hopeful and I had my fingers crossed, praying that we'd be able to open the restaurant on Sunday, and we were. And that was a real thankful thing too, because there were still tons of people without power, and all the people not all of them, but a huge percentage of the people that I waited on Sunday that came and got breakfast, they were still out of power and their houses were cold, and they were able to come and get some warm, delicious breakfast food. And that's awesome. Hey, High Tech 221. Awesome. Welcome in. I'm glad you're digging them. I'm going to be getting into another Dolores Cannon book called The Horns of the Goddess in the future here. It might be the next book I take on. I'm not sure, but it'll be soon. It'll be soon though, in the next couple of months. If probably maybe even this coming. Oh my gosh, we're almost in April. Probably in April. Welcome. So, this early ritual of consecration, therefore, seems to begin with the ceremony of giving names to the temple. Thus, it was believed that only through such a procedure could the temple acquire its essential functions and assume its final nature as the dwelling place of the god. By virtue of this ceremony, the temple was believed to have been brought to its real life. Since the ceremony is said to have been performed before the god, the lord of the temple entered it. It is or yeah, before the god, the lord of the temple entered it, it is evident that only through this ceremony could the temple be handed to its legitimate lord. The purpose of the ceremony of giving names was to confer the power of magical protection on the temple so that it could ensure the protection of the god. At this point lies the essential difference in the history of the two mythical temples. It has been noticed the name of the first temple that was believed to have been created in the mythical past, the Wetchesset derived from the means through which the foundation ground of the temple reacquired its sacred nature. Since the ground of the first temple was sacred prior to the foundation, and since the Mansion of the Falcon reenacted in its existence a sacred abode of an earlier date, the name of the temple only commemorates the restoration of the deceased world. There was, therefore, no need of a consecration rite, nor of a ceremony of giving names. In contrast, the solar temple did not restore, in the strict sense, the home of the earthmaker. It was the memorial of the victory of the gods, and this, too, is manifested in the names of the temple, which show an entirely different conception. On the whole, they appear to define the significance of the temple and to specify the purposes for which it should be used after it was handed over to its legitimate lord. Excuse me. It is worthy of note that in this tradition also, the god who was believed to be the only authority to give the temple names and to conduct the final episodes of the creation of the temple was again Tannin. His task appears to have been the creation of the temple. If we recall the detail that Tannin, after he revealed himself in the Island of Trampling, conferred the power of protection on two staffs by giving them names, it is likely that the tradition of the solar temple took the beliefs of an earlier sacred place and adapted them to its purpose. There is much similarity in the general significance of these two events. Only the manner of completing them is somewhat different. In the first instance, the creation of the magical protection by naming was completed before the falcon entered the enclosure of the Earthmaker. Here, in the tradition of the solar temple, the giving of names was performed before the temple was handed to its lord. A further resemblance can be seen in that, in both the name, once pronounced, conferred on an entity its final characteristics. The temple, once having been given names, was believed to have been filled with life, like a spear. And then, and only then, could it act and exercise its main function, the protection of the god. The consecration of the magical protection, by the means as described, is, therefore, the elementary but essential act of the early ritual of consecration of the temple. The second act was the festival of entering. We picture it as consisting, in the main, of a procession performed by the divine occupiers of the temple alongside the four walls of the enclosure. During this procession, hymns were sung and further acclamations recited. This procession led to the main sanctuary of the temple, at the front of which, probably, the final act of the festival was performed, the handing over the temple to its lord. It is most significant that Tannin, the earth god, initiated the life of the temple by giving names to it, seems to be again the sole divine power who was believed to be capable of performing the ultimate rite. Thereafter, as the third act of this ceremony, the presiding god adored the gift of the earth god, which was given to him as the only means of his protection on the earth. There are, of course, no relevant. Let's do that again. There are, of course, no relevant sources to confirm our reconstruction according to the Edfu evidence. It is unknown where and when this type of ritual originated. From the fact that the Edfu evidence projects this ritual into a mythical plane, it is evident that such a ritual must have existed in the organization of the early temple of at least proto-dynastic times. The character of this ceremony, when compared with what is known from the consecration ritual, which was in the use, or which was in use in historical temples, is readily understood. It is, therefore, suggested that the ritual of consecration, which we have been outlining, was the basis of the ceremonies performed later on in the historical temples. Pa Joe, good to see you. Welcome in. Awesome. Happy Monday. Happy Monday, dude. There are, of course, no relevant source. Oh, wait, I just read that whole thing, right? Yeah. Mhm. The Edfu records prove that the episode of bringing to life of the temple was included in the order of the creation, and that it was, in fact, the integral part of the history of the origin of the temple, since the divine powers who acted in the ultimate phase were the creators themselves. A further deduction that can be made is that the temple, after having been completed in its construction, required special act to reach its final significance as a temple housing and protecting the god. This ceremony might derive from what was the antecedent of the creation of the temple. The history of the solar temple proves it. Since the first evidence of a duly formulated ritual is connected with the solar temple, the Edfu documentary sources offer, therefore, one argument more in favor of the theory that ritual of the Egyptian temple was Heliopolitan in origin. Oh my gosh, okay, 27 minutes, that's great. Okay, I don't have any messages. Okay, so probably, I don't think we'll be, I think I might end up meeting with these awesome women a little later then. Okay, cool. So in that case, I'm going to go into chapter 16, which isn't a super long chapter either, maybe just a little bit longer than 15. Let's see if I can't get a sip of this boiling tea. Oh, it's delicious. It's just so hot. Even after 30 minutes. Wow. Woo! All right. Chapter 16. The homeland of the temple. The facts that can be deduced from the Edfu texts enable us to gain a fairly clear idea of the development and conception of the primitive temples in Egypt. They render it inherently possible to conclude that at Edfu we have only fragments, a selected number of accounts from a great and important history of the Egyptian temples. They furnish evidence that two distinctly different types of temple were believed to have been created in the primeval age in the subsidiary parts of Earth, pictured in our sources as the Paylands. Strictly speaking, the first and most primitive of these temples is the mansion attributed to the falcon, which is conceived as developing around the perch of the winged one, which was regarded as the result of the creation of the earth. The second type of temple to be that of the sun god. It is a much more developed structure, artificial in many respects, and was certainly not founded until after the creation of the world, and the first temple was completed. The bringing into existence of the temples is interpreted in a different way. We have no doubt that the origin of each of these two temples was influenced by different streams of religious thought, and that these two types of temple refer to different eras of the mythical age. One of the main arguments in support of our statement is the fact that the first temple is to be built, or rather, not is, okay, wait. One of the main arguments in support of our statement is the fact that the first temple to be built existed before there is any mention of the sun god himself or of his temple, and that one text actually describes the sun god as adoring and praising a which already existed, the great seat, and thereby acting in a junior and subordinate capacity. In addition to the mythological situation that can be sketched from the narratives, the title of the description of the temple in Wetchesset Neder confirms the view that the temple as an entity did not originate in the region where the solar cult was at home. It follows that there was a tradition of a temple of a remote state which was associated with the belief in the WR, or the eldest one. This temple must have been constructed from reeds, and after it had reached the final stage of its development, was constructed and reconstructed in many other places. From this type of temple, other sacred enclosures were derived, and this secondary type of sacred building is connected with the cult of the sun god. It is most likely that the Edfu record contain an attempt to describe the succeeding phase in the creation of the temple in a definite region. The sole concern of the theory implicit in the Edfu records seems to be the temple itself as an entity. Its connections with various deities appear to be the work of the tradition of a later date or the result of local beliefs. The creation story of the temples attributed to the sun god, therefore, would represent what can reasonably be described as the second part of the history of the Egyptian temple in general. It is likely that in the creation of the second type of temple, the development of genuine native sacred buildings was fulfilled. In our opinion, this time seems to refer to an important epoch in the history of Egypt. All right. Delaney, so good to see you. Happy Monday. Welcome in. Let me see what's shaking here. I got some text messages. Oh, got it. Okay. So, all right. No worries. I'm just getting updated on when I'm meeting with these amazing women. Okay. So, take a sip and continue. That's 7 p.m. my time. Okay. Okay. The continuity of traditions and the theory of two important periods in the history of the Egyptian temple seems to be plausible if we remember the situation in the secondary Paylands. In a land occupied by the Falcon and Tannin, near to the earliest or earlier structures described as the HWT or mansions, the new type of sacred building originated in the BW-TITI, or the place for crushing. In spite of the differences in the beliefs connected with the origin of each temple concerned, and the differences in the details of their constructions, we must admit, on the other hand, that there are affinities in their general structural development. These seem to accord with the continuity of tradition to which we have pointed above. If we take the main structural units of these two temples, we can demonstrate a connected line of development which seems to have occurred in a single region. The fact that in all the stages of this history, the same divine beings acted as creators of the sacred places and temples may be further support for our hypothesis. Right? Yeah. Ray, Rera. It's interesting. Okay. We had in the first stage the resting place of the god in an open field, which at a definite moment was surrounded by a fence. This type of sacred place seems to represent the place of worship of the ancestors. The text says nothing about eventual development. This type of primitive sacred enclosure produced the elementary unit of the mansion of the god, in which the first properly constructed sanctuary was made as the protection of the god's seat. To this courtyard, further constructions were added at its southernmost end. This then gave the first mansion of the god, or HWT-NTR, which at a definite moment was enshrined in a much greater outer enclosing wall. The original nucleus of this complex appears to be the starting point in the construction of other mansions, of which a definite part might have been sheltered, thus imitating the original type of sanctuary. The text does not describe their eventual development, but it alludes to a type of building which seems to reflect the appearance of the original courtyard of the first temple, which, though on somewhat different scale, developed at its southernmost end through the addition of two front halls. In great detail is described the stage of evolution which produced the final stage of the original temple. The record gives decisive evidence that at a particular moment of the mythical age, the building of the temple began with the erection of the outer enclosure, or INB. Here again, in spite of the differences in details, we find that the dimensions of the outer enclosures are equal, and that even the first courtyard to be constructed within the enclosure shows a breadth of 90 cubits, i.e., the dimensions of the original structure. It is true that each of the two main temples show an entirely different appearance in the organization of its interior, but we must bear in mind that the development, which we have been outlining, covers a very long period, during which much might have been altered and modified to meet the needs of the ritual service to be performed in these temples. Having said this, we must point out that these words are in no sense intended to prove that all the phases of this long development occurred on the same site. On the contrary, temples of such a physical appearance and various degrees of development were constructed and reconstructed in very many places of pre- and proto-dynastic Egypt. Nevertheless, in considering the of resemblances, in the general structural units of these buildings made from reeds or other light materials, there are points of contact that render it reasonably possible to conclude that there was a single center in which this type of sacred building originated. The Edfu records thus preserve the memory of an early religious center where the places of worship were constructed first. um, Having analyzed the Edfu documents and having attempted to trace the main line of the structural development of these sacred buildings, we must naturally inquire, where was the region in which these two types of temple originated? From the point of view of the myth, this region was the private home of the Earthmaker. The records do not explain what real land is denoted by this mythical domain. They scarcely give precise geographical data. The names of the sacred places which we can read in the texts are not confirmed by archaeological evidence from historical times. It is inherently possible that in the Edfu tradition, the origin and growth of the temple complex and the events which determined and affected its creation are projected into a region which is described as the first province of the Falcon. This name is known only from the Edfu texts, and evidently it replaced the name of the cultus place of the creator, the island of creation. We do not claim, however, that this name is to be considered as equal in significance to the name of the island of the egg. It is difficult to state dogmatically where the first province of the Falcon was situated, for there is no definite geographical evidence. But we must recall that our principal sources incorporate the local Edfu tradition, and that for the temple of Horus at Edfu, the primeval island was the site of the temple itself. As has already been indicated above, every temple throughout the country probably claimed to be the original temple and the site of the creation, and would thus adopt the original form of the myth for its own purposes. Thus, when the Edfu records speak of the first province of the Falcon, that term may well mean the district of which the historical site of Edfu and its temple formed part. But, wait, I didn't understand that. Thus, when the Edfu records speak of the first province of the Falcon, that term may well mean the district of which the historical site of Edfu and its temple formed part. But it does not by any means imply that the original version of the myth, the region, was also called the first province of the Falcon. On the contrary, in that version, it very probably bore another name, which would undoubtedly have been suppressed in the Edfu redaction. Interesting, right? I gotta respond to this message, y'all. Hmm. Hmm. Rachel has a meeting. Okay, back to it. I know she was busy at work. I wish she was able to respond to those messages, though, like an hour ago. But dang, it's been a good day, though. I've got a lot accomplished. So, in spite of editorial activities, the Edfu texts still retain sufficient pointers to render it possible to state with confidence where the original version of the myth was formulated and set down. It is impossible to read the principal Edfu records and not be struck by the very pronounced Memphite background and tone which is still preserved in them. The emphasis on the role of Tannin, who attends the birth of the temple complex, and who is present during the whole period of the development, especially if we recall the allusion to the reign of Tannin, as well as the Memphite connection of the creative deities, all points to the Memphite region as the source of the original form of the myth. Consequently, it may be expected that in the formulation of this myth, there are reflected traditions attached to the early sacred places of that region. In fact, a well-known text on the inner face of the enclosure wall of the temple at Edfu tells us that the temple was built at the dictates of the ancestors, according to what was written in this book which descended from the sky to the north of Memphis, which was all in italics. Interesting. We believe, therefore, that the basis of the Edfu tradition concerning the origin and nature of the temple complex was Memphite. In fact, we venture to suggest that the basis of the conception of the Egyptian temple was formulated at Memphis, just as Heliopolis and its temple were the basis of the ordinary daily ritual of the temple. If we are to seek the cradle of the Edfu traditions, we can hardly go far wrong in linking. That's hard for me. Let's see here. I'm so distracted. Okay. If we are to seek the cradle of the Edfu traditions in Memphis, we can hardly go far wrong in linking it with proto-dynastic times. Some hints of this may perhaps be seen in the geographical lists on the east-west inner faces of the enclosure wall of Edfu. The lists of the historical names are preceded by long, unfortunately much damaged, lists which contain many of the names recorded in the cosmogonical text. This, we suggest, is a hint that the names in question refer to sacred places such as once might have existed in the Memphite region during prehistoric or proto-dynastic times. The opinion that the Edfu records preserve the memory of a pre-dynastic religious center which once existed near to Memphis, on which the Egyptians looked as on the homeland of the Egyptian temple. It must be admitted that there is no scrap of archaeological evidence that such temples ever existed in Memphis. Nothing is, so far, known from archaeology about the organization of the early Memphite sacred places and the early Memphite constructions. Nowhere can we find evidence that in the Memphite region there existed an early sacred domain called Wetjeset Neder, in which the falcon was adored first. And yet the Edfu tradition emphasizes the idea that his sacred domain and its temple were closely connected with Tannin. Oh, dude, why is this doing that? Okay. Okay, cool. We're going to meet later. That sounds great. I'm just going to put this over here. All right. It is perfectly true that no precise pre-dynastic or proto-dynastic parallels to the type of the temple of the falcon and the solar temples that can be deduced from the Edfu texts have ever been found. Nevertheless, there are definite points of contact between the shrines depicted on archaic ceilings, which is Sealings, on archaic ceilings, and the theoretical reconstruction made from the Edfu material. Like a seal on a letter, a seal of a house. In view of the Memphite influence that can be detected in the Edfu tradition, it is natural and legitimate to ask whether the archaic cemetery at Saqqara can provide us with useful material. In the first place, in view of the notorious lack of precision in the Egyptian indications of orientation, there is nothing that need necessarily render it impossible to ask whether Saqqara, and more particularly the archaic cemetery, could not be the place to the north of Memphis where the mythical book was believed to have descended from the sky. Saqqara, in fact, or Saqqara, oh, I was just thinking of one of my favorite animes. Okay. Saqqara, in fact, is slightly to the northwest of Memphis. If, however, one examines the archaic cemetery at Saqqara, or Saqqara, there are certainly some features that immediately attract attention. In particular, the regular provision of an ambulatory around the superstructure. Tomb 3505 is of special interest. 3505. For in addition to the ambulatory, we find the tomb and a small temple together within the same enclosure. Tomb 3505, in fact, presents us with this combination of temple and place of funerary cults, in addition to an ambulatory that we have already noted was one of the essential features in the construction of the original Temple of the Falcon. We do not for a minute suggest that the earliest temples in any way resembled the tombs of the archaic cemetery, but we do consider that there are undeniable points of contact between the actual construction of the archaic cemetery and the theoretical reconstructions that can be made on the basis of the Edfu records. It may be that at Saqqara and Edfu, we have in the one in brick and in the other, in hieroglyphic, aspects of what was essentially the same Memphite tradition. We think, however, that the mythological records of Edfu reflect an earlier phase of this tradition than what is represented by the temple or chapel in Tomb 3505, since at Edfu there is not the slightest justification for postulating any any constructional material, but read insofar as the first temple, that of the falcon, is concerned. In support of this theory, further archaic sanctuaries can be cited. At Hyracon, okay, wait, this is a new one. Or like Hyracon, Hierakonpolis. Hieracompolis, all one word, capitalized. At Hierakonpolis, Hierakonpolis, at Hierakonpolis and at Heliopolis, there is definite evidence of the existence of archaic structures on relatively small oval mounds, which may, without undue difficulty, be imagined as imitations of the mythical mound or island. Regarding Heliopolis, another interesting fact can be cited. A tablet preserved at Turin 2682, shows a plan of an early shrine or temple at Heliopolis. The plan of this early Heliopolitan temple may perhaps be typical of the early temples of Heliopolis. The temple represented on the Turin tablet consists of three juxtaposed units, of which the central unit had a sanctuary against its rear wall. This sanctuary is called MSN and was used for the ceremony of erecting willow. Here, there is perhaps some connection with the primitive rites performed underneath the willow as described in Edfu records. Cool. The general position of the MSN sanctuary and its significance appear to be very close to the description of the archaic shrines. Moreover, the appearance of the sanctuary itself seems to be like that of the legendary shrine described in the Edfu records. It consists of a hall, which is surrounded by small side sanctuaries on three sides. Possibly the central part of that temple preserves the aspect of an early enclosure to which other smaller halls or cultist rooms have been gradually added. It is tempting to think that the setup of the temple, as it is represented on the Turin tablet, Turin, might comprise elements surviving from the prehistoric enclosures and temples constructed in the Heliopolitan region. At Armant, which is Armant, at Armant also, there appears to have been a proto-dynastic temple below the New Kingdom Temple. Sondage by Myers, Sondage, a sondage by Myers in the west forecourt of the temple revealed that below the layer of foundation sand of the New Kingdom were several floors associated with a not inconsiderable number of sherds, Sherd. Wait. At Sondage by Myers in the west forecourt of the temple revealed that below the layer of foundation sand of the New Kingdom were several floors associated with a not inconsiderable number of sherds and a few pots. Maybe it's sherds and a few pots and other objects of proto-dynastic date. Sondage and sherds. Let's find out. Is it sherds or shards? Sondage, Sondage. Oh, gotta have my fingers on the right letters here. Here we go. Sondage. Here are all the possible. No, not Sonder. Sondage. Sondage. Archeal, a deep trial trench. for inspecting stratigraphy. What? Sondage. Okay, wait. Sondage in English. A test of public opinion by asking people questions. Measurement of depth of water. Sondage or an opinion. Okay. A sondage. Okay, so yeah. Opinion? Wait. A sondage by Myers in the west forecourt of the temple revealed that below the layer of the foundation sand of the new kingdom were several floors associated with a not inconsiderable number of sherds and a few pots and other objects of proto-dynastic date. Sherds. A opinion poll. Okay. Sherds definition. No, that is it. It's pottery sherds. In archaeology, a sherd, or more precisely, potsherd, Potsherd, is commonly a historic or prehistoric fragment of pottery, although the term is occasionally used to refer to fragments of stone and glass vessels as well. Occasionally, a piece of broken pottery may be referred to as a shard. Okay, cool. Sherd versus shard. The plural form of shard is shards. A sherd is a broken piece of pottery with edges that are sharp, usually referring to one that is found in an archaeological site. In essence, the words shard and sherd are interchangeable, though the term sherd is favored by archaeologists. Cool. All right, cool. Awesome. 6. Okay, back to YouTube's StreamYard. Fractals? Fractals? Like pieces. Pieces. On the uppermost floor, Myers found, inter alia, 2 pits, which have every appearance of being foundation deposits, and which he dates to SD 78. No objects from the lower levels of the deposit could be dated earlier than SD 30 or SD 63. Unfortunately, the excavation covered too small an area to enable any comparison to be made. It is impossible to tell whether this apparently proto-dynastic temple at Armant was a mound, real or artificial, nor to tell of what materials the temple was built, nor whether there was an enclosure. All that can be said is that it is highly probable that there was a proto-dynastic temple at Armant below the New Kingdom temple, thereby indicating a continuous tradition, and that already at this early date the foundation deposit existed. The last primitive temple to which reference can be made is that at Medamud, Medamud, excavated by Robachon and Varie. So it's Robichon and Varille. Robachon or Robachon and Varil or Varia. I'm not sure. It is a most unusual and remarkable building with features that cannot yet be explained with complete satisfaction. The characteristic feature of this temple is 2 mounds, in each of which is a small rectangular chamber approached by a passage. It is immediately evident that this temple, primitive though it is the expression of a tradition entirely different from that of the temples on the Paylands, which is at the heart of the Edfu tradition. The temple at Medamud might have associations with the funerary cult, but this is not certain, and it is a question that lies far outside the scope of the present study. At the end of this exposition of facts, we draw attention to a well-known feature in the Osirian at Abydos, where, before the sarcophagus chamber, there is constructed in stone an island round which is a water channel. It is not impossible that this island, artificial though it appears, might have been regarded as representing the primeval land which was believed to be the first to emerge from Noon, and on which the first sacred place was created. This conception of a sacred place accords with the ideas disclosed by the Edfu tradition that the first sacred domain had strongly pronounced funerary associations. The same ideas seem to govern the organization of the cultist place of Osiris at Philae, as has already been pointed out above. Very little has come down to us from the early temple. The relics of an early architecture do not enable us to reconstruct an absolutely coherent picture. We do consider that there are, in many respects, points of contact between the physical aspect of the mythical temples and the little that remains from the early sacred places of Egypt. At this point, we must emphasize that the primitive temples of the Edfu texts, especially that of the Falcon, show a series of resemblances to the little that is known of the temples, the monumental architecture of archaic Egypt. The connections are all with proto-dynastic Egypt, perhaps also with the very end of pre-dynastic period. We incline to the opinion that the sacred book, the specification of the sacred mounds of the early primeval age, records the successive phases of evolution of sacred places and temples in one single region, which can reasonably be regarded as the homeland of the Egyptian temple. Our study has furnished convincing evidence that this sacred book was based, to a considerable extent, if not exclusively, on Memphite traditions and beliefs. It has every appearance of disclosing the history of sacred domains that were founded in the Memphite region during pre- and proto-dynastic times. The contribution of the Edfu texts is of high value and real interest, for from these records only can we learn what was the original Memphite type of sacred building and the organization of the real sacred enclosures at the dawn of history. For the Egyptians, the Memphite sacred domains were apparently of a mythical nature. They were the work of the gods themselves and were regarded as the prototype of the normal Egyptian temple of historical times. The theory that the Edfu myth of creation was taken over from the Memphite tradition may perhaps be supported by what the Edfu inscriptions tell us about the 9 ancestor gods of Edfu, who play an important part in the festival of the sacred marriage. The ancestor gods are not a part of the Memphite tradition, but they are of partly Middle Egyptian and partly Lower Egyptian origin, primarily of Heliopolitan Memphite origin. The inscriptions tell us that these gods came from various places and that they journeyed through the 2 lands and were buried at Edfu, thereby protecting and prospering Egypt. And it says, I'll just say, quote, "They traveled over the desert to him with dappled plumage and came to rest in the necropolis in the south of Egypt. They gave birth to the inhabitants of Upper and Lower Egypt," end quote. Here, in a different context, we find unambiguous evidence that the temple took over gods who were believed to have been born elsewhere in order to strengthen the claims of Edfu to be the home of the Egyptian people. Yet another valuable argument can be cited in favor of the theory that traditions could be taken over from one temple to another. The text referring to the cult of the Shebtu at Edfu makes it certain that the myth of the creation of sacred domains and temples was familiar at Heracleopolis, I think that's how you say it, Heracleopolis, No shred of evidence is known from documents of Heracleopolitan, Heracleop, Heracleopolitan, yeah, it's longer than Heracleopolitan provenance. So no shred of evidence is known from documents Heracleopolitan provenance. But the Edfu text tells us that the Shebtu created Heracleopolis by virtue of the magical rite of SW-IHT-T. It refers to the mansion of the ram, which might have been for Heracleopolis the first temple which was created and resulted from the consequence or resulted from the sequence of creation of the earth. It was founded by order of a defunct earth god on the payland that emerged near the island of creation. We suppose that Heracleopolis might have used the Memphite tradition for the explanation of the origin of its temple or temples. This is, of course, a conjecture for which there are no textual data. But it is known that the Heracleopolitan religious system was strongly influenced by Memphite traditions. In our opinion, it does not seem unlikely that from Heracleopolis, the Memphite traditions could have spread over to Upper Egypt and could subsequently have been taken over by the Edfu temple. Undoubtedly, and during Greek times in particular, the Edfu temple claimed to be the heir and the direct descendant of the original temple that came into existence in the Memphite region before the dawn of history. Michelle, so good to Queen. Welcome, girls. Welcome, everyone. All right, I've just got like 2 paragraphs left here. Let me get a drink on this. It's probably the perfect temperature now. Mm-hmm. So good. It is therefore suggested that each cultist center in Egypt was influenced by the same Memphite traditions concerning the creation of the temple, but adapted them to suit its local needs. Thus, at Edfu, the first mansion of the god is said to be the Temple of the Falcon. This, of course, is a tradition of a rather later date, if not only an Edfu tradition, to enhance the prestige of the cult of the Falcon Horus and Horus himself. Undoubtedly, the traditions of other temples, if they had been preserved, would have shown that the first mansions of the god were those of the local gods, and thus, from temple to temple, that other gods were the divine beings for whom the first mansion was created at the beginning of the world. We have, for instance, already mentioned the mansion of the ram at Heracleopolis. We conclude with confidence that the Egyptian conception of the temple was Memphite in origin, just as the daily service in the temple was of Heliopolitan origin. At the end of this discussion, we recall a very well-known belief from historical times. Ptah is generally regarded as the founder and builder of the Egyptian temples. In addition to the numerous instances which we find in the temple inscriptions of all periods, 2 quotations from the Edfu text can be mentioned. In a scene portraying the foundation of the historical temple in which the gods are said to have acted, Ptah is described as supervising the building of the historical temple at Edfu. Another Edfu text tells us that Ptah was the god who was the first to create the temple in the dim past, and in accordance with his creation, other temples were constructed all over the world. But the main Edfu cosmogonical records do not refer once to Ptah, which is Ptah. This seems to be an important historical fact. We venture to say that, in all probability, the Edfu texts disclose traditions of the Memphite region, which were earlier than the constitution of the cults at Memphis during the Archaic period. The historical Memphis might have adapted this myth, and, as a consequence, the chief god of the historical Memphis might have replaced the original creators. This hypothesis accords with what the Edfu evidence tells us of the sacred book, which was believed to have which was believed to have descended from the sky to the north of Memphis. Boom. DN, you made it just for the end, dude. And that is the end of chapter 16. So next time we go into this book, I think I'll have 2 more readings of this. But we're going to go into part 5, the doctrine concerning the origin of the temple. So dang, I might go live later with the Path of Alchemy tonight, but if I don't go live later tonight with that book, I'll do it tomorrow. So I'm sending you all the good vibrations, and I hope you're having a wonderful start to your week. And I thank you for joining me here. I thank you for all of your support, all of your comments, and all of your love. Hey, no worries, man. It'll always be there for you when you're ready for it. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, YouTube and StreamYard, and thank you to my family and my friends, and above all, thank you, God. Thank you, Spirit. So until next time, mwah, take care of yourselves. I'll see you so soon. Thank you.